एक जो हमारे बीच में सरकार है, जो रिजीम है, जो एक कम्युनल और एकदम मिसोजिनिस्ट रिजीम है, वो आज ये इम्प्लीकेशन दे रहा है लोगों को कि हम विमेन रिजर्वेशन बिल की बात कर रहे हैं, हम जो है विमेन का इमेंसिपेशन चाहते हैं, हम पार्लियामेंट में रिप्रेजेंटेशन चाहते हैं। और ये वही सरकार है, ये हमें याद रखने की जरूरत है कि जिन्होंने अभी ही कुछ ही दिनों पहले जब इस देश में रेसलर्स जो है अपने न्याय की लड़ाई कर रहे थे सेक्सुअल हैरेसमेंट के खिलाफ, ब्रिजभूषण सिंह जो इन्हीं के पार्टी से आते हैं, उनके खिलाफ जो है सेक्सुअल हैरेसमेंट के जो चार्जेस लगे और एक स्ट्रगल चला, काफी दिनों तक वो स्ट्रगल जो है सड़कों पर महिलाएं तरीके से रेपिस्टों के समर्थन में रैलीज निकाली, तिरंगे झंडे को लेकर जो है रैलीज निकाली गई। हमने देखा कि बिल्किस बानो जो जिनके साथ जो है इस तरीके से रॉयट में रेप हुआ, उनके जो अपराधी हैं उनको किस तरीके से बरी कर दिया गया, ये बोलकर कि ये जो है संस्कारी ब्राह्मण्स हैं, संस्कारी ब्राह्मण्स कैन नॉट रेप। किस तरह से शेमफुल वे में ना केवल ये बोला गया बल्कि इसी पार्टी के द्वारा जो है उनके रेपिस्टों को माला और फूल पहनाकर जो है रैली करवाई गई पूरे जो है स्टेट के अंदर। तो ये जो पॉलिटिक्स एक तरफ चल रहा है, ये जो इनका जेंडर जस्टिस का मॉडल है, जिसमें ये एक सर्टेन कपड़े पहनने से लोगों को यूनिवर्सिटी स्पेसेस तक आने से रोक देते हैं। हमने देखा कि किस तरीके से कर्नाटका में इस तरीके का डिबेट खड़ा किया कि अगर आप बुर्का पहनते हैं तो आप स्कूल्स में नहीं एंटर कर सकते, आप कॉलेजेस में नहीं एंटर कर सकते। तो जिस सरकार का ये इमेजिनेशन है कि विमेन का इमेंसिपेशन के लिए आप उनको यूनिवर्सिटी स्पेसेस तक नहीं आने देंगे, आप उनको क्या बोलते हैं स्कूल्स तक नहीं आने देंगे, एंड देन यू विल से कि दे डोंट नो व्हाट दे आर डूइंग, दे डोंट नो कि उनका चॉइस क्या है और क्या उनके ऊपर इम्पोजिशन है। तो अल्टीमेटली वी आर सीइंग कि एक सर्टेन रिजीम जो है वो एक तरीके का पेट्रियार्कल, एक तरीके का इस तरीके का जो कम्युनल पॉलिटिक्स है वो आज इस देश में हर जगह पे फैला रहा है। दूसरी तरफ हमने देखा कि ऐसा नहीं कि ये सिर्फ बाहर देश के अंदर हो रहा है, किस तरीके से इस यूनिवर्सिटी के अंदर भी जेंडर जस्टिस पर अटैक है। आज से नहीं बल्कि जब से ये रिजीम आया है तब से ही हमने देखा कि इस देश में फेमिनिस्ट पॉलिटिक्स जो है चैंपियन करने वाले लोग, चाहे वो भवरी देवी हो, जिन बहुत स्ट्रगल्स के बाद जो है विशाखा गाइडलाइंस आया है इस देश के अंदर। विशाखा गाइडलाइंस के तहत जो है हमारे यूनिवर्सिटी के अंदर जो है जीएस कैश जैसी एक बॉडी बनी, जो कि एक इलेक्टेड बॉडी थी जिसका काम केवल सेक्सुअल हैरेसमेंट के केसेस को डील करना नहीं था बल्कि एक जेंडर सेंसिटाइजेशन करना भी था। इस यूनिवर्सिटी के अंदर रेगुलर जेंडर सेंसिटाइजेशन जो है वर्कशॉप्स होते थे। बट हमने देखा कि जब नॉमिनेटेड आईसीसी यहाँ पर अपॉइंट हुआ तो उसके बाद जेंडर जस्टिस की क्या हालत है, अगर आप उनके नोटिसेस देखेंगे, अगर आप उनके टॉक्स में किस तरह से कॉन्वर्सेशन होता है वो देखेंगे, तो वो ये कहते हैं कि सेक्सुअल हैरेसमेंट के केसेस तो होते हैं, वो बहुत जेन्युइन है, लेकिन कुछ महिलाएं जो है फॉल्सली अक्यूज भी कर देती हैं। तो इस तरीके से जो बॉडी है वो इस तरीके के स्टेटमेंट्स पास कर रहा है। आप देखिए कि किस तरीके से पिछले सालों में जितने सर्वाइवर्स ने इन बॉडीज को रीच किया है कंप्लेंट फाइल करने के लिए, वहां पर किस तरीके से उनका शेमिंग करके उन्हें जो है डिस्करेज कर दिया जाता है कंप्लेंट करने से। कई बार इनफैक्ट मेरा खुद का एक्सपीरियंस है कि अगर आप वहां जाते हैं तो आपसे बोला जाता है कि आप ये कैसे कपड़े पहन के आ गए हैं, आप इतने बजे रात को क्यों उस लड़की के साथ घूम रही थी, आप क्यों उसके रूम पे गई थी। तो जिस तरीके का आज इस देश के अंदर फेमिनिस्ट पॉलिटिक्स का सिचुएशन है, जिस तरीके का एक अटैक फेमिनिस्ट पॉलिटिक्स पे इस देश के अंदर है, उसी तरीके का जेंडर जस्टिस पे अटैक यूनिवर्सिटी कैंपस में भी है। हमने देखा कि क्रिटिकल थिंकिंग और रीजनिंग का जो ये स्पेस है, ये यूनिवर्सिटी और तमाम सारी यूनिवर्सिटी जहाँ पर लोग अपनी क्रिटिकल थिंकिंग को जो है डेवलप करते हैं, लोग समझते हैं कि हाँ क्या अलग लेंसेज है जिससे हम सेम चीजों को देख सकते हैं, उस पर जिस तरीके का अटैक है इस यूनिवर्सिटी में हम देखते हैं। हमारे रिसर्च करने के लिए कई SSS के प्रोफेसर, कई SIS के प्रोफेसर, अलग अलग सेंटर्स से आने वाले प्रोफेसर जो रिसर्च कर रहे हैं उनको रिसर्च पे रोक लगा दिया जा रहा है, उनके ऊपर FIRs हो जा रहा है। स्टूडेंट्स एक्टिविस्ट जो अपने पॉलिटिक्स को रख रहे हैं आज यूनिवर्सिटी के अंदर, उनके ऊपर किस तरीके का अटैक है। हमारे बीच के कई साथी जो है अभी भी जेलों के अंदर बंद है, चाहे वो उमर हो, चाहे वो नताशा हो, चाहे वो दिव्यांगना हो, चाहे वो शर्जील इमाम हो। किस तरीके से आज जो डिसेंट को, क्रिटिकल थिंकिंग को, रीजनिंग को रखने के लिए लोगों के ऊपर अटैक हो रहा है। और ये सब जो है जब हम फेमिनिस्ट पॉलिटिक्स की बात करते हैं, जब हम बात करते हैं कि हम किस तरीके से अपने एजेंडा को आगे ले जाए, तो उसमें ये क्रिटिकल थिंकिंग को भी इमीडिएटली रखना पड़ेगा, क्योंकि बिना क्रिटिकल थिंकिंग के कोई फेमिनिस्ट पॉलिटिक्स नहीं हो सकता, ना इस यूनिवर्सिटी के अंदर, ना इस देश के अंदर। और इसी को डिस्कस करने के लिए आज जो है हमने ये टॉक को रखा है। अब मैं आपका ज्यादा समय ना लेते हुए जो है निवेदिता मैम को बोलूंगी कि वो इस टॉक को जो है आगे चेयर करे।
थैंक यू। सो
और हमारे साथ शुक्ला सावंत मैम भी मौजूद हैं जो निवेदिता मैम के बाद जो है।
सो व्हाट इज दिस फॉर देन?
दिस विल बी रिकॉर्डेड।
Okay, so good evening, friends, on this pleasant, breezy evening. Thank you for gathering under the trees because we've been driven out of every space in this university where any discussion can take place, as you know. And I'm so glad that we managed to reclaim spaces wherever we can. And outside Triple S2 has become a venue which I am very, very proud of because what I'm going to talk about today, I will come to feminist politics, but I want to first talk about, so there are three sort of ideas in the title of today, right? There's feminist politics, critical thinking, university. So I want to talk about university and critical thinking first. And what I'm very proud of is that, as is the case globally, the push for transforming universities they're very excited. They know what I'm going to say next, which is that the push for transforming universities globally, that push is coming from students. It's coming from your generation. It's coming from maybe a couple of generations above yours. But the pressure on universities to change, to decolonize, to become meaningful, that is coming from students. And that's something that one feels very proud of, to march behind students as they transform and take over universities globally. So let me first ask the question, what is education supposed to do? So I want to first address this critical thinking and the university. What is education supposed to do? So if you say, ask the question, what it is supposed to do is to socialize you into the world as it is. That is actually the purpose of education. Look at the word school and schooling. What does it mean? Schooling also means to discipline you, right? So you learn how to live inside a social order which is unjust, which is hierarchical, which teaches you how to obey, which teaches you who has privilege and how to maintain that privilege, which teaches you who doesn't have privilege and how to live in that way. So education is actually meant to do this. But what happens is, so it's a form of socialization, right? Education is a form of socialization along with religion, family, and other institutions. And this is what education is supposed to do. But what is interesting is that there's always a kind of way in which education escapes that as well. So I thought I would begin by telling you about a particular story of a school teacher in France at the time that France was coming into being. So Jacques Rancière he's written a text called The Ignorant Schoolmaster. And in The Ignorant Schoolmaster, he talks about a teacher called Jacotot who went to teach French in a Flemish-speaking region where the students didn't know French and he didn't know Flemish. So how did he teach them French? He didn't stand there and teach them the rules of grammar. He took a bilingual edition of a Greek classic, which for the moment is escaping my memory, and a bilingual edition which had Flemish on one side and French on one side. And he told them to figure it out because they knew Flemish. He told them to figure it out using what they knew of Flemish, and they were supposed to learn French from that, right? Because the Flemish is translated into French on the other page, and they actually learned French that way. The point that Rancière is making is that an intelligence does not need a teacher, hence the ignorant schoolmaster. So his point, Rancière's point is that everybody is born intelligent and equal. Equality is not something to be achieved, but you're already equal. And the task of a teacher is to reveal an intelligence to itself. So you don't really need a teacher. And then he gives other examples, Rancière, of how when you look at a calendar, when let's say when the parents of a student look at a calendar, they know that February has 28 days, so they figure out the word for February, right? Because they can see in the column 28 days, this is February, and that is how you learn. So this is what this is in very briefly. This is so Rancière uses this to talk about education as something by which you learn yourself. Now, what I find interesting is that Rancière does not take into account the fact that he doesn't ask the question, why do Flemish children have to learn French compulsorily? Why is a French teacher sent there to teach French to Flemish children? Why doesn't he know any Flemish himself? These are important questions because this is about the coming into being of the French nation state, which is marginalizing all the other languages, driving out all other languages, and making French the language of the nation state. And this is part of that nation state project, which is akin to colonialism, as other historians have pointed out, that the coming into being of a nation state is about producing the dominant identity as the normal identity. Now let's look at what this education really is, what Rancière is producing as such a ideal form of education. What is it basically doing? Teaching Flemish peasants to enter the world that the French nation state has created. They have to learn French. They have to also learn, for example, please can I not wear this strange thing? I keep tripping over it. So they have to also learn the calendar because they're peasants. They don't know the February has 28 days is not some knowledge that you're born with. They are being taught to enter calendrical time. They are being taught to enter modern modes of existence. And their own knowledges are being given no value. Jacotot learns nothing from them. It's a one-way process of producing the proper French citizen. So it's interesting for me that Jacques Rancière, who's an anarchist philosopher and so on, he is in fact a very interesting philosopher. It's interesting to me that none of these questions occur to him. So that's education in that sense. Now to him, I would counterpose the Brazilian scholar activist Paulo Freire, who wrote Pedagogy of the Oppressed. And Paulo Freire in Brazil, he talks about ways of teaching where you don't have a teacher and a student, but you have everybody is a teacher. So what he's saying is that the teacher enters the classroom and the student, well, in this case, it would be like consciousness raising among peasants. So you would be not necessarily a formal classroom. So what happens is the teacher, so the way he puts it is the teacher knows 5 things the students don't know, and the students know 5 things the teacher doesn't know. So this is the pedagogy of the oppressed, where education is a subversive project that doesn't teach you how to live in the world that has been created by the dominant, but which makes you question the world as it has been created by the dominant. But it also raises questions about what is knowledge. Is knowledge only what you get from these rarefied syllabuses, or is knowledge something that has to come out of where there's... So the idea is not that there is nothing that the teacher can teach you, but I think what is interesting is that from Paulo Freire, I get the idea that the teacher, as a the teacher in quotation marks, is the entry of the outside into your world, which means that anyone can be a teacher. Anyone can teach you something. And it's not only certain forms of knowledge that are legitimate, but there are multiple forms of knowledges that have to go into creating the pedagogy of the oppressed and subverting knowledge. So the university, therefore, to come to the idea of the university, in a sense, I see the university as utopia. By that I mean that it embodies a promise. The university, the public university, embodies a promise which is almost never fully met. It's always limited. The promise is of of this kind of subversive knowledge, access to all of that. So although it's limited, the idea of the university as embodying this promise of open knowledge, access to knowledge, social transformation, social justice. The idea of the university in this way um, is something that one can fight for. So that is actually what is interesting or important about the university as utopia. It's never ideal. No university is ideal. No university lives up to the 3 or 4 principles that I just talked about. But what happens is that within universities, then there are principles for which you struggle, right? You struggle for you struggle to change, you're critical of the closures that the university effects, you bring up questions of you meaning that this is what happens inside universities. Students do this. Sometimes faculty do it as well, and sometimes universities are dreamed of in that way. JNU actually was a dream also. If you look at the Parliamentary Act that set up JNU, there was a dream that it should not just be the children of rich people who have access to the university. So what happens is that inside universities, then there are and should be and have been struggles against exclusions on caste, on the basis of caste, class, gender, disability. Now, how can such questions not be political? If we understand political to mean, and I think we should understand political to mean to mean the struggle to transform power relations, if that's what politics is, then such questions are necessarily political. So to say that students should go into universities and not be political, it makes no sense, because your very existence is political. You are there because you have the privilege. So that you're already you're a walking, talking political beast in a university, because you embody privilege. So either you can accept that privilege or challenge that privilege. Because you have that privilege, you use it to challenge. It's already political. A university is necessarily a political space. And of course, at this point, it's very important to say that the idea of the nation, nationalist, these are all also nationalism. These are all extremely political questions. These are all extremely political ideas. So why is it not political to say nation above all, but political to say who is the nation? Both are equally political questions. So we cannot permit the closure of certain questions on the grounds that some questions are neutral, politically neutral, which will be defined for us. All other questions are political and not acceptable. So we cannot accept that. So critical thinking will be and is always based on the idea that our very existence in a university is already political. Now, here I think we need to be aware of the kind of ways in which universities are being challenged, and I think the best example is from South Africa. What South African students have achieved in the last few years is phenomenal. So this is what is now called the fallist movement. It began with Rhodes Must Fall, which was basically they pulled down the statue of Cecil Rhodes, who's a colonial imperialist, the imperialist who's got that. The fellowship, Rhodes Fellowship, is based on that, and he represents imperialism in South Africa, pulling down Rhodes, the statue of Rhodes. But it became a much bigger movement. It's not just about, so it's about three things. So it came to be called the fallist movement, because Rhodes must fall, fees must fall. That was the other element of it. The fees must fall because South Africa is a neoliberal, after the end of apartheid, it basically became a neoliberal economy in which universities are simply not accessible. That's the kind of system that now the NEP is trying to establish here, to end public universities, to destroy public universities, and to privatize and corporatize education. That is the purpose of the national education policy, which is being implemented all around us. And public universities are due for the axe. But what the fees must fall movement is about free education. The very pressure of these students has actually forced free education onto the agenda of political parties in South Africa. The pressure of the students to, and the third aspect of the Fallist movement is to decolonize the syllabus. Now, when they say decolonize the syllabus, there's a kind of a debate with faculty who are progressive faculty, who have in fact been part of the anti-apartheid struggle. Many of the faculty may have even gone to prison during the anti-apartheid struggle. But when it comes to what should be the content of education, there's a bit of a debate, and I'm not sure where I stand on it, because one of the big pushes of the students is to say we don't want to study white Western thinkers anymore. Now, some faculty might say you need to know what the mainstream is before you start rejecting it. Do you really not want to know what Kant said? Or do you really not want to know what, Marx said? Do you only want to study thinkers from Latin America and South Africa and Africa as a whole? So but you understand, there is a debate. This is the point. There is no one answer that has been arrived at. There is a debate about the content of syllabi, how to decolonize syllabi. Students are active in this movement. There are conversations among faculty and students. The conversations are often bitter and very, very fraught. But it is about thinking, talking, critically analyzing. So the Fallist movement can teach us a lot. If you look up the Fallist movement, we have in fact had South African students here in JNU who have spoken when students were protesting at UGC, when our JNU students were protesting at UGC about there was a move to end non-net fellowships. There were students from South Africa and JNU who spoke at that meeting and who spoke as those who supported the Fallist movement. Now I want to just make two more points. So I'll make two more points. The final point will be about feminist politics. So the next point I want to make has to do with a very interesting set of questions that arose in my mind when I saw this debate between the Ashoka University student. So you know what happened in Ashoka University. Faculty have lost their jobs over a very important paper which has not suited the interests of the current regime. That faculty member lost his job. Other faculty members who supported them have lost their jobs. And Ashoka carries on in its merry way, although there are a lot of internal protests. Now, this is a point at which I also want to say that what we call permanent teaching jobs in India, or what in America is called tenured positions, is not only about security of income. It is about security to speak freely. We have to understand that permanent jobs in academics, or what are called tenured positions, are necessary to ensure that people will have the freedom to speak and not have the sword of Damocles hanging over their head about when will I lose my job if I say something. So that's an important point to note. But in the course of this issue, a student said in an interview somewhere that private universities like Ashoka are capitalist factories and they will never produce a Bhagat Singh or an Umar Khalid. In response, one of the founders of Ashoka said, all this was happening on social media, he said, that's no parent sends their children to universities to climb the gallows. This is pretty much what he said, to climb the gallows and be hanged. So if Ashoka is a boring place, good, that's what parents want. Now, I found it absolutely fascinating. It's like rich. I felt I could write a paper on it. Of course, as academics, we think we can write a paper on anything. But I really thought, look at the issues that are coming up here. Now, when the students said that it will not produce, etc., what is interesting is that both of the people the student named are actually also extremely scholarly inclined. They're scholars. Umar is a historian. He's a very, very fine historian. He's not just a political activist. Bhagat Singh died when he was like younger than many of you. He was 23 when he was hanged. But those who have read his writings know it's a very fine thought. So it's interesting that so one point that I want to make about that is that when the student says it does not produce these people, uh, it's actually I felt it was a bit of a red herring, as we say, right? A red herring is something that takes you in the opposite direction. So it enabled the founder to say, well, who wants to send their children to be hanged, right? I think the purpose of a university is not to produce these figures, but these figures emerge over and above what the work that the university is doing. You think of any political activist that you know, you think of everyone you know who's in prison today, and the names, if I just stood here and read out the names, it's a roll call of honor of journalists, intellectuals, scholars. These are not people who have come into universities to be X. They came into universities to do their intellectual work, and they thought about what is going on, and they spoke out. And that is the price that they are paying, that so many of the people we personally know or are aware of are in prison for speaking up against an extremely unjust and an anti-democratic regime, an authoritarian regime, a fascist regime, even I would say. So that was a bit of a red herring, because they didn't come to the university to become these political figures. But if you're in a university today, you are bound to speak up, as I said, because it is political to just be here. Just being here is political. It's a political act. But what I was also struck by was the founder's invocation of the parent, that the parents don't send their children to. So this is a very important figure, the parent. The parent represents social order. The parent, as a figure in his account, represents the conventional, patriarchal, sexist, classist, casteist social order. The parent sends the child into the. So we hear this a lot with women's hostels. When women, because women's hostels, as you know, there are huge movements against it, and Pinjra Tod, as you know, is one of the most active. But the idea that women have to be inside by 6 p.m., etc., which you don't see in JNU, but it's there in women's hostels all over. What is usually said when people protest that, students protest it or faculty protest it, is that, but the parents want us to do this. The parents don't want us to give the girls this kind of freedom. In their own home, they would have to be in bed by 7 or whatever. So, of course, there are 2-3 questions we can ask. What if parents come and say it's okay? So, will you allow the parents who allow their daughters to be out, will you give them separate rules from the students whose parents say, yes, get them in by 6? So, this is nonsense, right? They're not really asking parents what they want. What if parents say, we want free education for our children? Are you listening to the parents? So you decide when or if the parents say, you know what, I feel my child should know more about feminist politics. Please teach her about, so will you accept that? So it's really the invocation of social order. And we need to ask parents who are spending their hard-earned money, etc., or in JNU's case, they say taxpayer, but the taxpayer is actually not Adani and Ambani. The taxpayer is the person who buys a packet of salt. The indirect taxes are what gives the government its resources in India today. It's the person who drives a cycle rickshaw. These are the people on whose backs we are in this university and in public universities. We are not being supported by middle class taxpayers. So So when you say that a parent can decide what the university should teach, this is a highly disingenuous, dishonest way of addressing an issue, because it's the university that decides what the university will teach, and the parents can ask for anything they want. They are not going to accept what the parents say. And the parent in this case is the invocation of, we are trying to train students to enter the social order as it is. But students escape that. This is the whole point of critical thinking. And I know that I probably may have been expected to speak more about feminist politics than about all of this, but I don't see how this is not feminist politics, number one. Everything I said is already feminist. But I do want to say that feminist politics, although it starts with a focus on patriarchy, gender, sexuality, and these kinds of issues, there is no way that feminism or any feminist position would be only about gender, patriarchy, sexism, etc. Because feminism is about recognizing the most marginalized position and standing there and looking from that position outwards, which means that sometimes as feminists we will prioritize caste. Sometimes, as feminists, we will prioritize class, and we will hope that anti-caste activists and Marxist activists and leftist activists will sometimes prioritize feminist politics over caste and class. It depends on that issue. It must take the most marginalized position in any situation. So it would mean, and I will just quickly wind up with this, that of course you start with recognizing gender-based injustice, which includes access to universities for women, which includes hostels for women, sexual harassment, which is a huge issue. Shukla will be speaking about it more. And this sexual harassment is very much also top-down, faculty on students. But there is also a way in which, and I think we all know that, that coming into this space, it's suddenly gone off, that it has a life of its own, a mind of its own. So when we talk about sexual harassment, we need to talk, of course, about institutions that actually end impunity for sexual harassment, both in a top-down faculty-student situation, but also among students, and about the institution and the way in which the GS cash was ended, and so on. Shukla will speak more about that and other things. But what I wanted to say is that one hears about sexual harassment as quite commonplace, even in JNU. And I say even in JNU because there's a long history of challenging it, but I think things have changed in the past many years. One hears about incidents of sexual harassment at freshers' parties, all kinds of things. And there must be institutional accountability, and that's something we will always fight for, but there must be a social accountability that we have towards one another. When you know that sexual harassment is happening or has happened at a party, if it's or someone tells you it has happened, there has to be a culture in which we stand by one another, in which the sexual harasser is shamed, in which the sexual harasser is made to feel the pressure. So we have to build it. I'm not talking about vigilantism. I'm not talking about going and slapping him and being all macho about that. But active attention and support for women's dignity and for the dignity of all genders, that is something that we have to build as a culture among ourselves, regardless of the institutional pressures. So we really do have to stand up and speak when we see something like this happening, which means, of course, that so sexual harassment is one, obviously, one issue that would be very much central to feminist politics. But of course, also queer politics, anti-caste politics, the politics of class. Feminist politics would really struggle and fight to make the university not just a space for critical thinking, but to fight for the access to the university of groups and classes and castes that have been kept out of the university. That is the feminist responsibility to speak up for all of that. Thank you.
So I thought of beginning by talking about a couple of articles that the head of this university, who is a woman, has written in the last 1 week. And the first was really in response to a book that has been released called Jagala Pokharanari Davi Valvi. It's a Marathi book written by a gentleman called Abhijit Zog, who is a mass communication expert and obviously involved in promoting the ideology of the current political dispensation. Now, the word or the title translates into the world destroying leftist termites. And for me, that was, an interesting point of departure to actually take this conversation ahead, because I think the gentleman doesn't know that every single sculpture, especially that large Natraj that sits now outside the convention center, is first made in clay that is obtained from termite mounds. That termite clay is so fine that when a sculpture is made in wax and then cast using a clay mold, it is that termite clay that picks up every single detail. But also remember that the craftsmen and women who are involved in making the clay are not really allowed into that temple for which they make those sculptures and for which they make these wonderful artifacts. So the left ecosystem, I think, has a very important task to do. We have to be the termites that produce that wonderful soft clay with which we actually produce beautiful objects. Now, having said that, I think I'll take up the issue of women in university. And we also know, for instance, that the same vice chancellor who has been talking a lot about her own feminist politics has repeatedly talked about how this ecosystem has become increasingly friendly towards women. I just have a simple question to ask. Why have the statistics that will tell you how many women have come to the university over the years, have they increased or have they declined in number? It's the statistics that will tell you the truth. Now, for the last several years, we know that these statistics haven't come out. We do not know the student's body that comes into GNU today. The student's body that's coming into GNU is coming through a very strange examination system that is based on multiple choice. We know that the multiple choice format favors people who are technologically advantaged. We also know because these exams have to be conducted in places where there are computer centers means that the number of centers to conduct these exams have gone down, which also means that women now being allowed by families and parents to take these exams are also diminishing in number. A simple survey of your own classroom will tell you that the number of women entering into the university has gone down drastically. Feminism is not something that only women practice. Feminism is something that everybody who is sensitive to these issues practices. And it is because of the feminism of this campus 2 decades ago, 3 decades ago, that the university introduced something called the deprivation point system that ensured that women entered into this university through a slight advantage that was given to them in the marks that, on the basis of which a merit list was created. This also ensured that we got students from across the country from areas that did not have representation in universities. It was the feminist politics of the students' body that ensured that this system was brought into place. Now, having done away with that, what has happened to the students' body here? This is a question that you need to ask. Now, if you think of the other kinds of bodies that had been created in this university, to ensure an equitable system. One of them was GS Cash. The GS Cash, the gender sensitization body, was also something that was a unique body, that was an elected body, which meant that students could send their elected representatives to the body. The teachers could send their elected representatives, the administrative staff, the karamcharis, every single union in the university could actually send elected representatives to this unique institution. And the main function of this unique institution was to conduct gender sensitization workshops in hostels, in classrooms, and also in these kind of open spaces and forums. Now, we know that the last Vice Chancellor, I will not go into details about how the GS Cash came to be dismantled, but I was at the head of the GS Cash when the last Vice Chancellor decided to dismantle it and introduce a nominated body. There is a big difference between how a nominated body conducts its affairs and how a GS Cash, which was an elected body, would have conducted its affairs. Ask the Vice Chancellor, has the Internal Complaints Committee put out annual reports? The answer is no. If the ICC, which is now the current body, had put out an annual report, you would know the number of cases that had been handled by the body. You would know the outcome of the cases. You would know where justice had been delivered and where it had not been delivered. You would know whether the number of cases were going up or coming down. Right now, in the absence of these statistics, we know nothing. We only hear occasionally about what has transpired in an ICC meeting, and by and large, the kind of workshops that have been conducted, almost all of them seem to show an inclination towards a very, very conservative politics. It's unlike the kind of body that we had earlier, where people would participate on a regular basis. People would ensure, as Nivedita pointed out, a certain kind of a social consensus about how genders should behave towards each other. Now, that kind of a consensus, unfortunately, is disappearing because nobody seems to really understand how important it is to ensure that spaces are safe for everyone on this campus, every single gender. The spaces that we move around in, where we study, where we interact, these need to be safe. These need to be places where people can express opinions in a free and a fair kind of a way. But as we know, all these spaces have completely disappeared. So just with those few lines, I'd actually like to open this up to the audience here so that we can actually proceed in a more discursive way. I'm happy to answer questions from you, and so will Nivedita.
Not want to know what, well, Marx said, do you only want to study thinkers from Latin America and South Africa and Africa as a whole? There is no one answer that has been arrived at. There is a debate about the content of syllabi, how to decolonize syllabi. Students are active in this movement. There are conversations among faculty and students. The conversations are often bitter and very, very fraught. But it is about thinking, talking, critically analyzing. So the Fallist movement can teach us a lot. If you look up the Fallist movement, we've in fact had South African students here in